By the time I was 12 years old, the family story about me had already been written. Not by me, I never got a say in it. It was written by my older sister, confirmed by my mother, and quietly accepted by everyone else at the dinner table. The story went like this. Diane was the smart one. Diane was the ambitious one. Diane was going places. And Marcus? Marcus was the sweet one, the harmless one, the one who'd figure it out eventually. Maybe. Hopefully. We'll see. I grew up in Mississauga, Ontario, in a house that smelled like my mother's beef stew on Sundays and my father's wood shavings from the garage. My father was a carpenter, a quiet, careful man who measured twice and cut once and never said more than he needed to. I think I got that from him. My sister Diane got everything else, the grades, the confidence, the way she could walk into a room and make everyone feel like they'd been waiting for her. I wasn't jealous of Diane, not exactly. I loved her. I just knew, very early, that in the family scorecard that mothers keep in their hearts, whether they admit it or not, I was trailing, not failing, just trailing. When Diane got into Queen's University for business, my mother cried at the dinner table. Happy tears, the proud kind. When I told my parents 2 years later that I wasn't going to finish my business diploma at Sheridan College, that I wanted to cook, that I'd been offered a kitchen apprenticeship at a restaurant in downtown Toronto, my mother didn't cry. She went very quiet, which was worse. You're going to be a cook, she said. Not a question. A verdict. A chef, I said. There's a difference. My sister, who was home for the weekend, looked up from her phone and gave me the smile. Not a mean smile. Diane was never mean to me directly. It was the patient smile, the one that said she understood something I didn't yet, and she was willing to wait while I caught up. Marcus, she said, just make sure it's something you can actually build a future on. I was 20 years old. I drove a 2003 Toyota Corolla that had a crack in the dashboard and a passenger window that only went down 3/4 of the way. I had $400 in my savings account and a set of chef's knives I'd bought secondhand from a culinary student who'd dropped out, and I had something nobody in my family gave me credit for. I was paying attention to everything. I spent the next 6 years in kitchens. Not glamorous kitchens, not at first. I started at the bottom, the way you're supposed to, doing prep work, cleaning stations, learning to break down a whole chicken in under 3 minutes and make a stock from scraps that tasted like someone had poured their soul into it. I worked under a French-trained chef in Yorkville who had a temper like a gas flame, high and blue and completely precise. He was cruel sometimes, impatient always, but he taught me to taste a dish and hear what it was missing. That's not a metaphor. Good chefs actually listen to their food. I learned that from him. By the time I was 26, I was sous chef at a well-regarded farm-to-table restaurant on King Street West. By 28, I was executive chef. By 30, I was thinking about something bigger. I want to be clear about something. I was not secretly wealthy during any of this. I was not driving a Corolla while sitting on a pile of investments. I was working 70-hour weeks, saving carefully, living in a one-bedroom apartment in Etobicoke with furniture I'd mostly found on the Facebook marketplace. I was building slowly, the way my father built things in his garage, measured, deliberate, without announcement. The opportunity came through a woman named Patricia Chen, a commercial real estate broker who ate at the restaurant every Tuesday and always ordered the lamb 2 ways. One afternoon she stayed after her meal and asked if I'd ever thought about owning my own place. I told her I thought about it every day. She told me she had a space in the distillery district, a former warehouse conversion, exposed brick, soaring ceilings, the kind of space that food magazines put on their covers. The previous tenant had failed, which meant the renovation was already done, and the lease terms were motivated. I was 31 years old. I went to 2 banks before the third one said yes. I brought in 2 silent partners, both of them regulars from the King Street restaurant who believed in my cooking enough to write checks. I signed the lease on a Tuesday morning in February, standing in that empty room with the winter light coming through the tall windows, and I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't realized had been unsettled my whole life. I named it Ridgeline. The first year was the hardest thing I've ever done. There were weeks where I slept 4 hours a night, where I personally called every supplier to negotiate better terms, where I ran the front of house when my manager got sick, and the kitchen when my sous chef quit. But we made it. By the end of year 1, we had a wait list on weekends. By year 2, a food critic from Toronto Life came in on a Thursday, And the review ran 6 weeks later with the headline, "Ridgeline is the best new restaurant you haven't heard of yet." After that, people had heard of it. Here is what my family knew during all of this: that I was a chef, that I worked at some restaurant downtown, that I seemed to be doing okay. I wasn't secretive about my life out of strategy, not in the beginning. It was more that the conversations never really opened a door for me to walk through. When we gathered for Christmas or Thanksgiving at my mother's house in Mississauga, Diane talked about her promotions. She was in financial consulting by then, doing genuinely well, flying to Calgary and Vancouver for client meetings. My mother asked her detailed questions. She asked me if I was eating enough. I wasn't bitter about this. Or maybe I was, a little, in the way you can be bitter about something and still love the people causing it. I'd made peace with being underestimated. In some ways, I'd used it. There's a particular kind of focus that comes from no one expecting anything from you. By the time I was 34, I owned 3 restaurants. Ridgeline in the Distillery District, a smaller wine bar called Thornwood in Leslieville, and a private dining concept in Rosedale called the 44th that did prix-fixie dinners for 12 people at a time and had a 6-month waiting list. My staff across all 3 locations totaled 62 people. I had a small office above Ridgeline, where I split my time between recipe development and the business side of things: payroll, supplier contracts, event bookings, the endless practical work of keeping 3 kitchens running. I still drove a Toyota, a newer one, a 2019 RAV4, but still, old habits. My mother knew I had a restaurant. She had never been to it. That's not an accusation. I had invited her. I'd invited Diane too, several times, and they'd always said yes, and then something had come up. A conflict with a client, a birthday party for a friend. My mother's hip had been bothering her. It was never refusal. Exactly. Just a series of postponements that eventually became the status quo. I stopped pushing. My father had come, once, the year Ridgeline opened. He'd sat at the bar and eaten the tasting menu and said, afterward, very quietly, "You built something good here, Marcus." That was enough for me. The wedding invitation arrived in late March. Diane was marrying a man named Christopher Holt Bay Street Wealth Management, the 3rd-generation kind of money that comes with a certain easy confidence, the kind of man who looked at a menu price and didn't register it at all. He was perfectly pleasant when I'd met him at family gatherings. He shook my hand firmly and called me the chef brother, which I think he meant as a compliment. The wedding was set for mid-June at a hotel in downtown Toronto. Not just any hotel, the Pemberton Grand, which had recently been renovated from a century-old bank building into one of the most talked-about event venues in the city. The wedding reception was to be held in the Grand Ballroom. Rooms started at $500 a night. The wedding block was at $450. I booked my room the day the invitation arrived. About 6 weeks before the wedding, I was at my mother's house for a Sunday dinner. Diane was there with Christopher. It was a pleasant enough evening until dessert, when the conversation turned to wedding logistics. "The hotel block closes next week," Diane said, looking at me across the table. "Did you get a room?" "Already done," I said. Christopher reached over and touched Diane's hand. "The rooms are beautiful," he said to the table generally. "The suites are incredible. We upgraded our parents to junior suites." "Marcus," my mother said, with a very specific tone. She had that combined concern and prediction. "You know you don't have to stay at the hotel itself. There are very reasonable options nearby. A hotel a few blocks away on Adelaide would be much more sensible." "I'm staying at the Pemberton," I said. A small silence. "Those rooms are $450 a night," Diane said, not unkindly, just informatively, as if maybe I hadn't seen the number. "I know," I said. Christopher looked at me with a benign, slightly puzzled expression. "That's the wedding block rate," he said. "Regular rate is over $600. "I know," I said again. My mother looked at her dessert. Diane looked at Christopher. Christopher looked at me with the particular expression of a man trying to be tactful about something he finds slightly uncomfortable. "Marcus," Diane said finally, in a gentle voice. "The voice you use with someone who is about to make a mistake you could have prevented. It's 3 nights. That's over $1,000 just for the room. I love that you want to be there, but honestly, the hotel on Adelaide is perfectly nice. There's no shame in." "Diane," I said quietly, "I've already booked." Another silence. My mother began collecting plates. "I just think," Diane continued, because Diane always continued, that you should be practical. You work so hard. It doesn't make sense to spend that kind of money on something you can't really afford when there are perfectly good alternatives. I looked at her. I thought about 6 things I could have said right then. I said none of them. I appreciate the concern, I said. I'll be fine. The drive back to Toronto that night, I sat with that conversation in the quiet of my car and thought about what exactly had just happened. Diane had not been malicious. That was the honest truth. She genuinely believed she was helping me. She had a picture of me in her mind that was 20 years old, the younger brother who trailed behind, who made unconventional choices, who drove old cars and probably lived closer to the financial edge than he let on. She was protecting that version of me. She just hadn't noticed that version of me had been gone for a long time. I almost said something, almost called her that night to explain. Then I decided I wouldn't, not for dramatic reasons, not to set up a reveal, just because I was tired of explaining myself to people who had already made up their minds about who I was. If Diane wanted to know my life, she could ask about it. She never really had. The week before the wedding, I got a call from my event coordinator at Ridgeline, a sharp young woman named Keiko who handled all our private bookings and venue partnerships. She had something in her voice I recognized as suppressed amusement. "Marcus," she said, "did you know your sister's wedding reception is booked at the Pemberton Grand?" I told her I did. "Did you know," she said, "that the Pemberton Grand's ballroom catering is done by us?" I did know this. The Pemberton Grand had partnered with Ridgeline 14 months earlier for their ballroom and private event catering. It was a significant contract, one of the most valuable we had. Our logo was on the catering menus. Our name was on the event packages. The executive banquet chef was one of my people, a former Ridgeline sous chef named Devon, who I'd promoted into the role specifically for this contract. What I had not known, until Diane sent the wedding invitation, was that this was the hotel she'd chosen. "Keiko," I said, "let's keep this low-key. I'll be attending as a guest. I don't want anyone making a fuss." She laughed. She told me she couldn't promise Devon would be able to contain himself. The wedding ceremony was at a church in Forest Hill on a Saturday morning in June. The kind of June day that makes you understand why people fall in love with this country. Warm, golden, the trees in full leaf, the sky, a specific shade of blue that only exists in the brief window between spring and the real heat of summer. Diane looked genuinely beautiful. My mother cried. I sat in the second row and felt something uncomplicated and good. At the reception, I arrived at the Pemberton Grand in my room key, already in my jacket pocket. I'd checked in the previous afternoon, settled into my room, had a quiet dinner at the hotel bar, and gone to bed early. The lobby of the Pemberton Grand was everything the renovation had promised. Soaring ceilings, the original marble floors restored to a deep, veined white, the old bank vault now visible behind glass as a design element. It was a beautiful space. I was proud of what the design team had done with it. I found my table, family table, round of 8, close to the dance floor. My mother was already seated, talking to Christopher's parents. Diane's maid of honor, a woman named Priya, was adjusting a centerpiece. A few cousins I hadn't seen in years circled and hugged me and asked what I'd been up to. "Cooking," I said. One of my cousins, Ryan, grinned. "Yeah, I heard you have, like, a little restaurant or something?" "Something like that," I said. The appetizers came out first: a amuse-bouche of smoked trout on cucumber rounds, then a roasted beet salad with whipped goat cheese and candied pecans. I watched my family eat the food from my kitchen without knowing it was from my kitchen and felt a strange, quiet amusement about the whole situation. Christopher's father leaned over to my mother during the salad course and said, "The catering is extraordinary. Do you know who they used?" My mother shook her head pleasantly. I reached for my wine glass. The main course was a duo plate, herb-crusted Ontario lamb and a seared halibut with a saffron beurre blanc. Devon's execution was perfect. I made a mental note to tell him so Monday morning. By the time dinner was winding down, Christopher's uncle, a loud, cheerful man named Gerald, who was 3 glasses of red wine into the evening, leaned across the table toward me. "So, Marcus," he said, "Diane tells me you're a cook? You work at a restaurant?" "I do," I said. "Which one? Anywhere I'd know?" My mother, who was listening, answered before I could. "He works at a place in the distillery district," she said. "It's nice. Small." "Ridgeline," I said. Gerald's wife, seated next to him, looked up from her plate. "Ridgeline," she said. "On Parliament?" That's the one, I said. We've been there, she said, turning to Gerald with wide eyes. Gerald, that's where we went for our anniversary. Remember? The tasting menu? Gerald stared at me. That's your restaurant? That's my restaurant, I said. My God, he said. He looked at my mother. Did you know this? My mother smiled the way you smile when you're recalculating something quickly. Of course, she said, in a tone that was about 60% convincing. Gerald turned back to me. That place is extraordinary. My wife has been talking about that meal for 2 years. Thank you, I said. We have a good team. I watched my mother's expression across the table as this exchange happened. It was subtle, she was too composed for it to be obvious, but there was a flicker of something there. A small, private recalculation, the image updating, slightly. An hour later, I was standing near the bar talking to one of Christopher's university friends when I noticed a shift in the energy at my family's table. I looked over. Devon had come out of the kitchen, still in his chef's coat, which was unusual for a service like this, and was speaking to someone at the table. I moved closer. Devon was speaking to my mother and Diane. Diane had gone still in that particular way people go still when they're receiving unexpected information. I came to stand at the edge of the conversation just as Devon was finishing. I just wanted to personally ensure the family of the owner was happy with the service this evening, Devon said, with the kind of professional warmth he was very good at. The bowl was kind enough to allow us to keep things low-key tonight, but I wanted you to know that our entire team here is grateful for the partnership. Diane looked at me. Her expression was precise and unreadable. The catering, she said. Not a question. Devon runs our banquet operation, I said. He used to be my sous chef at Ridgeline. Devon smiled pleasantly at the table, excused himself, and went back to his kitchen. My mother said nothing for a moment. Then, you catered your sister's wedding. The company catered the wedding, I said. I'm here as a guest. You own the company that catered the wedding, Diane said. She was still very still. Ridgeline does the Pemberton's ballroom events. Yes. Has for over a year. Diane looked at Christopher, who had arrived at her shoulder and was following the conversation with a politely confused expression. Your brother, Diane said to the room, more than to any specific person, owns the restaurant that catered our wedding reception and has a room upstairs. Several rooms, I said, and then regretted the phrasing because it sounded more pointed than I intended. I mean the hotel partnership, not rooms I own. Just, I'm staying here. My mother reached across the table and touched my hand. It was a small gesture, but it was the first time in as long as I could remember that she reached for me first. Marcus, she said, quietly, why didn't you tell us any of this? I thought about that question. I'd thought about it a lot, actually. In the quiet drives home from late-night kitchen closes, in the early mornings before service when the restaurant was empty and the light came through the windows at a low angle. Why hadn't I told them? Not out of spite, not to set up a moment like this one. It was simpler and older than that. You never asked, I said. And I said it without anger, because that was the truth of it, not an accusation, just a fact, the way a carpenter states the measurements of something before he begins. Diane looked like she'd been handed something heavy and was deciding how to hold it. We didn't resolve everything that night. Families don't. The evening continued. There was dancing, there was cake, there was Christopher's best man giving a speech that made everyone laugh. I danced with my mother once, a slow song near the end of the evening, and she held my hand very tightly, tighter than the dance required. Before I took the elevator up to my room, Diane found me near the coat check. I said things that were condescending, she said. She was direct like that. Always had been. It was actually one of the things I respected about her. At Mum's, before the wedding, about the hotel room. You were looking out for me, I said, the way you understood me. I don't think I've been paying attention, she said, to who you actually are now. I didn't make it easy, I said. Still, she said, and we stood there for a moment in the way siblings can stand together, not quite resolved, not quite back to the beginning, somewhere in the complicated middle ground that is most of family life. I went upstairs and stood at the window of my room, looking out at the city, the lights on the lake, the CN Tower, the particular nighttime glow of a city that is always partway awake. I thought about my father in his garage, measuring twice before he cut. I thought about a 20-year-old version of myself driving a cracked dashboard Corolla toward a kitchen in Toronto with $400 and a second-hand knife roll. I thought about what it cost to build something slowly, in the dark, without anyone watching or applauding. Not everyone gets to stand at a window like this. I knew that. I'd known enough hard-working kitchen people who never caught the break, who had the talent and the drive and the timing just slightly off. I didn't carry what I'd built as a trophy. I carried it more like my father carried his best work quietly, with the knowledge of every mistake it had taken to get there. The city was still doing what cities do, moving, humming, indifferent to any single person's story. I was 35 years old. I had 3 restaurants and 62 employees and a room on the 9th floor of a building that served food from my kitchen. My sister was downstairs dancing at her wedding. My mother had reached for my hand. It was, all things considered, a decent Saturday night. Here is what I want to say to anyone who is somewhere in the middle of their own quiet building before the window, before the moment people look up and recalculate. The people who love you are not always capable of seeing you clearly. That is not always cruelty. Sometimes it is just the limitation of the picture they formed of you when you were young and unfinished, and they haven't had enough new information to update it. That is partly on them, but honestly, it is partly on us too. We have to let people see us. We have to offer the update. Not to prove something, not for the reveal, not for the vindication, but because relationships require new information to stay alive. Silence is a form of distance, even when it doesn't feel like one. Build in the quiet. Work in the hours nobody sees. Let the work speak when the time comes. But don't wait so long that the people you love have been left with a 20-year-old photograph of someone you no longer are. You owe them the current version of yourself. And more than that, you owe it to yourself to be fully known by the people who matter. Success is not a revelation you hold in your back pocket until the right dramatic moment. It is a conversation. Start it earlier than I did.